3 exercises that are essential for core training. They're not going to be the usual ones, the normal ones that I talk about, plank, side plank, bird dog, bridge. We're going to start developing on that and building on top of that to build a greater core training program. If you want to build your core strength, stability, endurance, or even what's called speed strength around your core, then you can click the link below. You can sign up to my online gym, which is coming out in 2022. So just register for it and you'll get all the early bird options. So yeah, that's just the link down in below. These essential core exercises are going to be doing something slightly different to what we would talk about with regards to the abdominal wall or the lower back muscles or those types of things. Because what we want to do now is we want to integrate the hip and the torso. So we need to start bringing in the lower legs. I've mentioned these aren't the normal type of core exercises because we're not going to be working the torso in isolation. We're going to be trying to integrate the hips and the torso, because when we've got those two working together, we've got a much more stable spine, core and torso as a whole. We also then need to work on 3 different positions. Because we're working the lower body and using the lower body, we can basically go into 3 different positions. So we've got this position with the feet alongside each other, we've got a single leg stance, and also we've got a split stance. So those are the 3 basic positions of the lower body. So those are the 3 basic positions we need to use. We also need to use what are known as planes of movement, which is essentially from back to forward, from side to side, and from rotation. So they're the 3 basic planes of movement. So these 3 exercises integrate the hip and the torso. They use the 3 positions of the feet: bilateral, single leg stance and split stance, and they use the 3 planes of movement. So we're getting the biggest bang for the buck when it comes to training the hips, training the torso and getting them integrated. Exercise number 1 is what I call the static side lunge. So what we do, this is our bilateral stance, so both feet are on the floor. What we've also got is we're going to be using the sideways plane of movement. So what we're doing is we're coming down into this position. This leg stays straight. Obviously this leg is moving. The hip goes back and the hip goes forward. So we're using the hip hinge. So what we're getting now is we're going into here. So with the hip hinge, we're getting glute max to work. Because we're moving to the side, we're activating the lateral seam, which would include TFL, glute medius, glute minimus. We will also get in this a bit of the obliques and the QL because we're going down to one side. We then come up and then we would drop down the other side. So again, we're alternating each side. So we're integrating into the hip flexion and that lateral movement. So we're not only getting glute max, we're getting glute medius, glute minimus, obliques, QL, all in that same movement. So exercise number 1 is the static side lunge because we're getting hip flexion, sideways movement, and we've got the feet alongside each other. Exercise number 2 is the suitcase carry. What we're using in this exercise is the forward or front to back plane of movement, which is known as a sagittal plane, and we're also using the split stance. How we're also integrating all the muscles is by having a weight on one side of the body. So we're integrating, in fact, we'll start with the plane of movement. So we're in this position. So we're coming and we're walking forward. So that's the plane of movement covered. With regards to the split stance, we are here. We're in this split stance. Yes, we've got the single leg stance as well, so it could be an extra element to it, but we're using it for that split stance and we're walking through. So we've got the plane of movement and we've got the position of the feet. When it comes to integrating all those muscles, so we've talked about glute max, minimus, medius, QL, obliques. When I've got this in this hand, I can feel all of these muscles working. If I keep it close, they tend to shut off a little bit. I can still feel that some of them are on, but they're not. Now they're on. Now I can really feel them. So again, as I'm using the QL and the obliques in the single leg stance, I've got, in the split stance, I'm stabilizing all through that area so the spine is nice and stable. What I can then do is with regards to coming up into the single leg stance, I will then start integrating glute medius, glute minimus into it. So it's a very important exercise to be able, along with the static side lunge, to be able to not only integrate all those hip muscles, but get the whole of the core working, because not only are we using that sideways movement, we're now starting to use that forward and back movement. Because when the movements change, when the direction of movements change, so do your muscles. So we need to be including these types of exercises into core training, because when we go about life, we're going to be changing directions. We need our body to respond to those changes in directions, and we can enhance that and develop that using exercises like we've talked about so far. Exercise number 3 is called the hip aeroplane. Now this uses the final foot position, which is the single leg stance, and the final plane of movement, which is known as the transverse plane, or where we would rotate. So what happens is we come into this position, and then from here we open out, and then we close off. We open out into external rotation. We can even go that little bit further and drop into internal rotation. So what's happening here? So I've talked about the single leg stance. I've talked about the plane of movement because we're rotating. So what's happening with the muscles that are working? Well, number one, because we go, just like in the static side lunge, because we go into that hip flexion, we take pressure off the knee. So we're getting the hip working. If I was to go down like that and my knee to come forward, I can feel much more in the quads and I can feel much more tension around the knee. If you've got any sort of knee problems, it's much more effective to get the hip back, so we take that pressure off the knee. But also, it's just a much more effective way of doing things, is keeping all the pressure in the hips, because they've got the muscles and the joint to do that. So we've got the hip flexion and the hip hinge taking the pressure off the knee. What we've then got, single leg stance, so you've got adductors, glute medius, glute minimus, TFL, all those muscles working to hold the knee in place. What we're then doing is we're challenging the glute medius and glute minimus that much more, because we're asking them to go through their range of movement as well. So again, we're keeping that solid position through the hip as we go up and round, and then up and down into that position. What we're also doing with the exercise is integrating the QL and the obliques, because we're keeping the hips and shoulders. So from here, the hips and shoulders stay in line all the way through. If I was going like that and my shoulders were staying level, I'm not integrating the QL and the obliques as effectively as I could. So we have to use the hip aeroplane in that specific way of keeping the hips and shoulders in line to be able to do that. So to quickly summarise what we've talked about, the 3 essential exercises to develop core training are the static side lunge, the suitcase carry, and the hip aeroplane. The static side lunge is using the sideways plane with the bilateral stance, and it's integrating all those lateral muscles that we've talked about. Glute medius, glute minimus, QL, and obliques through that sideways movement. You've got the hip hinge as well, which is taking pressure off the knee. Exercise number 2 is the suitcase carry, working in the sagittal plane or the forward and back plane. And we've got that split stance in there as well. With regards to the weight, because the weight's on one side, the opposing side has to do a lot of work to be able to stabilize the spine and integrate the pelvis. And then exercise number 3, which is the hip aeroplane, which is the final stance, which is that single leg stance in the transverse plane, is integrating the stability of the hip with the movement of the hip, and then stabilizing it and integrating it with the torso, whilst engaging the obliques and the QL as you do that rotation by keeping the hips and the shoulders in line all together. So those are my 3 essential exercises. If you've started the plank, the side plank, the bridge, the bird dog, add those 3 exercises in and it will develop it that much further. If you want programs to do that for you, you can go through, as I mentioned, to my online gym, which is in the link below. Just register for it. It's not being released until 2022. If you're a beginner, you can start with the proven 12-week program that I've been using for the past few years, and then that will develop you into more intermediate and advanced workouts. If you're intermediate and advanced, just jump straight into those workouts from the get-go. So many thanks for watching. My name's Chris. I'll speak to you in the next tutorial.